All right, get ready, because today we're going deep, really deep into the future of energy, specifically in India. We're going to be looking at how they're tackling this challenge of turning their ambitious green energy goals into, well, a reality.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area. Right now, we're talking solar, we're talking wind, a whole lot of innovation happening.
Absolutely. And kind of our roadmap for this deep dive is this in-depth report, a roadmap actually, put together by the India Smart Grid Forum. It's all about energy storage systems in India, and it covers a pretty long period from 2019 to 2032. So we're really getting that long-term view.
Yeah, it gives you a good sense of where things are headed, and it's a really exciting time for India's energy sector right now. They're really pushing the boundaries.
So to kind of set the stage a little bit, India has made some, pretty serious commitments when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I mean, some big goals. They pledged to reduce emissions intensity by, get this, 33 to 35% by 2030. And that's compared to 2005 levels, so it's a substantial reduction. And on top of that, they're aiming for 40% of their energy to come from non-fossil fuel sources, also by 2030.
Wow, they're not messing around. Those are some big goals. And, it seems like they're putting their money where their mouth is, especially when it comes to solar power. Yeah. They initially set this goal with the Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission of 20 gigawatts of grid-connected solar power by 2020, but they smashed that target. And they've now set this new goal of 100 gigawatts by 2022.
Yeah, and a big part of that is the incredible growth we've seen in rooftop solar in India.
It's super exciting, but I imagine when you start talking about integrating all that rooftop solar into the grid, there must be some challenges that come along with that. So what are some of the biggest hurdles from your perspective that they're facing in this area?
Well, one of the key issues that comes up is this concept of hosting capacity. And you can think of it almost like a highway. A highway can only handle so many cars before you start getting, traffic jams, everything slows down. The same idea applies to the electrical grid. Each section of the grid has a certain limit to how much rooftop solar it can handle before you start seeing problems.
Okay, so problems like what kind of problems are we talking about here?
Well, imagine a neighborhood where everybody's installed, massive solar panel systems on their roofs. Now, on a sunny day, all that extra power flowing back into the grid, it can cause voltage fluctuations, it can affect power quality, and in some cases, it could even damage equipment.
So it's not just as simple as saying, okay, let's just add more and more solar panels, the more the merrier. There's actually some thought that needs to go into how you balance that with the existing grid infrastructure.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance. And actually, the report found that, most states in India, they've actually imposed limits on how much rooftop solar penetration is allowed. Usually, they cap it at around 25% of the distribution transformer's capacity.
Okay, so they're trying to find that sweet spot, encouraging solar adoption, but also making sure the grid can handle it. It's all about that balance.
Yeah, you got it. And that's where this idea of energy storage really comes into play. It's like this key to unlocking the full potential of not just rooftop solar, but renewable energy in general.
It's like the missing piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah. Think of energy storage as a buffer, like a shock absorber for the grid. It allows us to capture all that excess solar energy during the day when the sun's shining bright, and then we can release it later on when the sun goes down or even when demand spikes. So it helps to smooth out those bumps in the supply and demand curve, makes those renewable energy sources much more reliable.
It's like turning an unreliable energy source into a reliable one. It's fascinating. I'm curious, though, when you say energy storage, there are so many different types of energy storage technologies out there. What are some of the leading contenders, and what are the pros and cons of each?
That's a great question. There are a lot of different options out there, and each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. One of the technologies that's been around for a while is pumped hydro energy storage. It's very efficient, been around for a long time, essentially uses excess energy to pump water uphill to a reservoir, and then when you need energy, you release that water downhill through turbines to generate electricity.
Okay, it sounds pretty straightforward, but I imagine it's not always feasible to just, build a reservoir wherever you need it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The biggest limitation with pumped hydro is geographical. You need very specific terrain. You need 2 reservoirs at different elevations, so it's not always an option.
Location, right? So what about, I've also heard about compressed air energy storage. Is that a viable option as well?
Compressed air energy storage, or CAS as it's often called. Yeah, it's another interesting technology. It works by storing energy by, compressing air into these underground caverns or specialized containers. Then, when you need the energy, you release that compressed air and it drives turbines to generate electricity.
So it's kind of a similar concept to pumped hydro, but using air instead of water.
You got it. But it faces a similar challenge in that it relies on having the right geological formations available. Not every location has suitable underground caverns, so that can be a limiting factor.
I see. Then there's this one that always sounds kind of futuristic to me, flywheel energy storage. What is that all about?
Yeah, flywheel storage definitely has that sci-fi feel to it. Essentially, it uses a rapidly spinning rotor to store energy, and the really cool thing about flywheel storage is its speed. It can deliver a burst of energy incredibly quickly, so it's great for things like frequency regulation on the grid, where you need to respond to changes very, very rapidly.
That makes sense, especially when you're dealing with a grid that's trying to balance those fluctuating solar power inputs.
Exactly. Now, while all those technologies have their place, this roadmap really focuses on batteries as the most promising solution for India's energy storage needs. And in particular, they highlight lithium-ion batteries.
Ah, yes, lithium-ion. The batteries that are seemingly everywhere these days, from our phones and laptops to electric vehicles. What makes them so well suited for this kind of, large-scale energy storage application?
Well, a few key reasons. First of all, their energy density is remarkable. They can pack a lot of power into a relatively small space, and that's crucial when we're talking about grid-scale storage.
So efficiency of space is key.
Absolutely. And then there's the speed factor. They can charge and discharge very rapidly, which makes them ideal for stabilizing grids that rely on those intermittent renewable sources. And on top of that, lithium-ion batteries have a long cycle life. They can go through many, many charge and discharge cycles before their performance starts to degrade.
So efficient, compact, and durable. No wonder they're taking center stage in this energy storage revolution. Now, this report dives into a really interesting tool they developed called the Energy Storage India Tool, or ESIT for short. It's designed to evaluate both the feasibility and the economic viability of energy storage projects. Sounds pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated tool. It can analyze network load data, optimize storage capacity for different scenarios, and even predict the financial viability of a project. And the really cool thing is that it can look at things from both the feeder level and the customer level, meaning it's not just for these massive grid-scale applications. It can be used to evaluate energy storage for businesses or even individual homes.
That's fascinating. So it's a very versatile tool.
Yeah,
And
sure.
you mentioned that the ESIT can evaluate both monetizable and non-monetizable benefits of energy storage. Can you break that down for us? I think those terms might be new to some of our listeners.
Sure. So monetizable benefits, those are the ones that directly translate into financial savings or revenue. Things like peak shaving, which we talked about earlier, that helps reduce peak demand and lowers electricity costs. Or participating in demand response programs, where you actually get paid to reduce energy use at specific times.
So these are the benefits that make energy storage a financially attractive proposition.
Exactly, but then there are these non-monetizable benefits, and these are valuable, they're important, but they're a bit harder to assign like a dollar value to. Think about things like preventing economic losses from power outages, or the environmental benefits of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels.
So these are those kind of like quality of life benefits that are definitely important to consider, even if they don't directly impact, the bottom line.
Absolutely. And the report really emphasizes the need to develop market mechanisms that can account for the full range of energy storage benefits, both monetizable and non-monetizable.
So it's about, recognizing the value of those non-monetizable benefits and finding ways to factor those into the equation.
Exactly. That's how we're going to make energy storage a truly attractive investment for everyone involved, from utilities to businesses to individuals.
Okay, so we've talked about how crucial energy storage is going to be for India as they move towards this greener energy future. But what does that future actually look like? How much storage are we talking about? And where's it all going to go?
Well, this roadmap actually lays out some pretty impressive projections, breaks it down by all these different applications where energy storage is going to be needed. So for starters, there's the integration of all that variable renewable energy, mostly solar and wind, into both medium and low voltage grids.
Right, because you've got to make those renewable sources more reliable if you want them to be a major part of the energy mix.
Exactly. And then you've also got energy storage for the extra high voltage grid, which is like the backbone of the transmission system. So we're talking about storage needs at every level, from the local distribution networks all the way up to the national grid.
It's like building this whole new energy ecosystem. It's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's not just about the grid itself. They're also thinking about energy storage for electric mobility, electric
Well,
vehicles.
of course. I mean, as electric vehicles become more and more popular, you're going to need a way to charge them all without, overloading the grid.
Exactly, and efficient charging is going to be essential to make that happen. Then the report highlights something that, people might not think about as much, which is energy storage for telecom towers.
Oh, that's interesting. Why is energy storage important for telecom towers?
Well, think about it. Reliable power is absolutely crucial for telecom infrastructure. If you have an outage, it can disrupt those communication networks, which can have a huge impact. So energy storage can provide that backup power, ensure those towers stay online no matter what's happening with the main grid.
So it's about resilience. It's about redundancy in those critical infrastructure systems.
Exactly. And then there's energy storage for data centers, for UPS systems, for inverters, all those critical systems that need that extra layer of protection in case of a power outage.
So making sure those essential services stay up and running makes sense.
Yep. And then they even look at the potential for energy storage to replace diesel generators, which is pretty exciting.
Now, that's a win-win. I mean, cleaner energy
Right.
and potentially some cost savings, too.
Right. Diesel generators, they're noisy, they're polluting, and they're expensive to operate. So replacing them with energy storage, that's a big step forward. And finally, they look at, any other applications where you need over 1 megawatt of power. So they're really thinking big picture here, covering all the bases.
Yeah, they're definitely casting a wide net. And you mentioned earlier that the report really stresses the need to keep this roadmap updated. I mean, how do you even begin to plan for something like this when the technology is evolving so rapidly?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the world of energy storage, it's changing so fast. What's considered cutting edge today might be, old news in a few years.
It's like trying to predict the future.
It is, but that's why they emphasize the need to revisit and update this roadmap regularly, to keep pace with those technological advancements. But even with all that uncertainty, this roadmap provides a really solid framework, and it shows that they're committed to adapting as those new technologies emerge.
So they've got the vision, and they're willing to adjust the plan as needed. That's good to hear. Now let's talk a little bit about, how they actually plan to make all of this happen. Because having the technology is one thing, but you also need the right policies in place to create that supportive environment for energy storage to really flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't just rely on the technology itself. You need the right incentives, the right regulations to really make it all come together. And the report does a good job of outlining those policy recommendations. First and foremost, they say you got to integrate energy storage into the overall energy strategy, make it a central piece of the plan.
So don't treat it as like an afterthought or an add-on. It needs to be baked into the strategy from the beginning.
Right, exactly. And they also suggest enabling energy storage systems to qualify for multiple revenue streams.
Okay, now what does that mean in practice? Can you give us an example?
Well, right now, a lot of the focus is on how energy storage can help reduce peak demand, save money on electricity costs. But energy storage can also play a role in providing grid stability, integrating renewable energy, even deferring the need for those costly grid upgrades.
So it's about recognizing the full range of benefits that energy storage can offer, not just focusing on one or two.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of introducing time of use tariffs and pay for services tariffs.
Okay, I think I need a little help with those. What are those and how would they benefit energy storage?
Sure. So time of use tariffs, that basically means the price of electricity varies depending on the time of day. So it encourages people to use energy during off-peak hours when demand is lower. And energy storage can play a big role here because you can charge your batteries during those off-peak hours when electricity is cheap and then discharge them during peak hours when it's more expensive.
So it's like buying low and selling high, but with electricity.
Exactly. You got it. And that helps consumers save money on their bills, and it helps reduce those peak demand periods, which benefits the grid as a whole.
It's a win-win. Okay, so what about these pay-for-services tariffs? How are those different?
So pay-for-services tariffs, they're kind of similar, but they go beyond just the time of day. They're designed to compensate energy storage providers for the specific services they're offering to the grid. Things like voltage support or frequency regulation.
So it's about creating a fair market where energy storage providers are rewarded for the value they're bringing to the table.
Right, exactly. And beyond those tariff structures, the report also calls for incentives to encourage project development and financing, especially in those early stages when costs can be higher.
So kind of like giving those projects a little boost to get them off the ground make them more financially viable.
Exactly. And finally, they recommend supporting demonstration projects, which are basically these real-world test cases for different energy storage technologies and approaches.
So like a proving ground where you can see what works, what doesn't, and then you can scale up those successes.
Precisely. So all of these policy recommendations, they really paint a clear picture of how India is creating this supportive environment for energy storage to take off.
It's about laying the groundwork, setting the stage for this energy transformation.
Exactly. And now, if you're ready to get a little more technical, the report actually dives pretty deep into the weeds on how rooftop solar interacts with the grid.
Okay, let's get technical. I love it.
Yeah.
So I know they did some, in-depth load flow analysis to understand those interactions. But for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, can you explain what load flow analysis is and why it's important in this context?
Sure. So imagine you're trying to manage traffic on a highway. You need to know how many cars are on the road, where they're going, how fast they're traveling, all of that to prevent those traffic jams. Load flow analysis is kind of like that, but for electricity. It's a way to map out how electricity is flowing through the network, understand the impact of different factors on that flow, things like rooftop solar.
So they're basically creating this model of the grid,
Right.
and then they can run simulations to see how different scenarios play out.
Exactly. And they looked at different types of feeders. Those are the lines that distribute electricity in various parts of India. And they wanted to see, okay, what happens when you start adding more and more rooftop solar to the mix? How does that affect things?
And did they find any common challenges that arise when you have a high penetration of rooftop solar?
Yeah, they did. One of the biggest ones is voltage fluctuations. So if everyone's solar panels are pumping power into the grid at the same time, it can cause the voltage to rise too high, and that can damage equipment.
Right, I guess too much of a good thing can be a problem.
Exactly. And on the flip side, you can also have what are called voltage sags, where the voltage dips too low. This can happen when there's a sudden increase in demand, like everyone turning on their air conditioners on a hot afternoon. If the grid isn't prepared to handle that surge, the voltage can drop, and you might experience brownouts or even blackouts.
It's definitely not ideal. So it's all about finding that balance, making sure the grid can handle both the influx of solar power and those fluctuations in demand. What other challenges did they uncover?
Well, they also saw issues with loading, which is basically the amount of power flowing through a specific line or transformer. If you have too much power trying to squeeze through lines that aren't designed to handle it, you can run into problems.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Right. And they also looked at power quality issues, things like harmonics and voltage unbalance, which can affect the efficiency and reliability of the grid.
So it's not just about the quantity of power, but also the quality of that power.
Absolutely. All of these factors need to be considered very carefully when you're integrating rooftop solar into the grid.
It sounds incredibly complex. I mean, how do they even go about conducting these load flow studies?
They use this specialized software called CYMDS to model different scenarios and analyze the results. It's a really powerful tool that allows you to simulate different conditions, change different variables, and see how the grid responds.
It's amazing how technology can help us understand and manage these complex systems.
It is, and they even went a step further and created a CYMDS library of modeling tools specifically for photovoltaic systems, and they're making that available to other utilities.
That's great. I mean, sharing that knowledge and those tools, that can really help accelerate the adoption of rooftop solar in a safe and effective way. So they've identified these challenges, but what about solutions? What are some of the ways they propose to actually address these issues and make rooftop solar integration smoother?
Well, the good news is the report doesn't just focus on the problems, they offer some very practical solutions as well. One of the key areas they highlight is the importance of voltage regulation, which is all about keeping the voltage within that safe and acceptable range.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do they propose to do that?
Well, there are a variety of devices and techniques that can be used, things like voltage regulators and on-load tap changers. Think of them like traffic lights for electricity, helping to keep things flowing smoothly and preventing those voltage spikes and sags.
I like that analogy. It makes it much easier to visualize.
Right. And they also talk about reactive power compensation, which is a way to address the issue of power factor. Power factor is essentially a measure of how effectively electricity is being used. So a low power factor means some of that electricity is being wasted. And reactive power compensation helps to improve the power factor, which reduces those losses and makes the grid more efficient.
So it's about optimizing the use of the electricity we're generating, making sure it's not going to waste.
Exactly. Another big part of the solution is smart inverters, which are becoming increasingly common.
Yeah, those are like the brains of the solar panel system, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Smart inverters can do a lot more than just convert the DC power from the solar panels to AC power for the grid. They can actually monitor grid conditions, adjust their output to match demand, and they can even provide grid support services like voltage regulation and frequency control.
So they're like these little grid guardians, making sure everything stays balanced and stable.
Exactly. So by combining those smart inverters with those voltage regulation techniques and reactive power compensation, they're creating this much more robust system that can handle that influx of rooftop solar.
It's fascinating how all these different pieces have to work together to make this whole system function.
It is, and they also highlight the importance of careful planning and coordination. Utilities need to have a really clear understanding of the potential impacts of rooftop solar and take steps to mitigate those impacts before they become problems.
So proactive planning is essential.
Absolutely. It's much easier and more cost-effective to address these issues up front than to try to fix them after they've already become a problem.
Makes sense. Now let's dive a little deeper into the different energy storage technologies themselves. The report provides a good overview of kind of the current state of the market. So what are the main players in the energy storage game right now?
All right, so as we mentioned earlier, pumped hydro storage, it still dominates the market in terms of installed capacity globally. It's a proven technology, but it has those geographical limitations that we talked about.
Right, those reservoirs aren't always easy to come by.
Exactly. But the report also highlights the really rapid growth of battery energy storage systems, or BES, as they're often called, which are systems that use batteries to store energy.
Yeah, I imagine that growth is being driven by, falling cost and increasing performance of batteries, especially lithium-ion batteries.
Absolutely. And within the world of batteries, lithium-ion is definitely the front runner right now. It's becoming increasingly popular due to its high energy density, its efficiency, and its versatility.
It's like the Swiss Army knife of energy storage.
I like that. Great analogy. But the report doesn't just focus on lithium-ion. They also look at other battery technologies, including the good old lead-acid battery.
Oh, yeah, lead-acid, the workhorse of the battery world. I mean, they've been around forever.
They have, and they're still widely used, especially for backup power applications. And they're constantly being improved. The report even mentions these advanced lead-acid batteries that offer a longer lifespan and better performance.
So they're not going away anytime soon.
Not at all. They still have their place, and the report also looks at some more specialized battery technologies, like sodium-based batteries and flow batteries.
Okay, can you give us a quick rundown on those? What are they best suited for?
Sure. So sodium-based batteries, they're good for specific applications like grid-scale energy storage and integrating renewable energy. And flow batteries, they show a lot of promise for longer duration storage, like storing energy from solar panels during the day and then using it at night.
So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job. Different applications have different requirements.
Exactly. And the report doesn't shy away from the technical details. They even get into the different types of lithium-ion battery chemistries.
Okay, I have to admit, chemistry is not my strong suit. So can you break it down for us non-chemists? Why is it important to consider the different chemistries?
Sure. So the different chemistries, they have different characteristics that affect things like their energy density, their power output, their cycle life, and their safety.
So it's kind of like choosing the right type of flour for baking.
Yeah.
You need the right one for the specific recipe.
Yeah, I like that. Another great analogy. Some of the common lithium-ion battery chemistries out there are lithium cobalt oxide, lithium manganese oxide, lithium iron phosphate, and nickel manganese cobalt. Each one has its strengths and weaknesses.
So it's about finding that balance, choosing the right chemistry for the specific application, taking into account factors like performance, cost, and safety.
Exactly. And the report highlights the importance of considering the operator temperature and environmental impact when you're selecting a battery technology.
Right, because you want to make sure those batteries can handle the heat, especially in a place like India.
Exactly. And minimizing the environmental footprint of both the battery production and disposal, that's crucial as well.
Sustainability, can't forget about that. Now, there's another term that I came across in the report that I wasn't quite sure about, the C rate. Can you shed some light on that for us?
The C rate, yeah, that's basically a way to measure how quickly a battery can be charged or discharged. So imagine you have a battery that can store 1 kilowatt hour of energy. If it has a C rate of 1C, that means it can be fully charged or discharged in 1 hour. If it has a C rate of 2C, it can do it in half an hour, and so on.
Okay, so a higher C rate means faster charging and discharging.
Exactly. And the C rate is an important consideration when you're choosing a battery for a specific application. Some applications need those quick bursts of power, while others need that slower, steadier discharge.
So again, it's all about matching the technology to the specific needs of the application.
Precisely. And the report also looks ahead and talks about some of the expected technological improvements we're likely to see in batteries in the coming years.
Okay, crystal ball time. What does the future hold for battery technology?
Well, they anticipate continued cost reductions, which is great news. And they also expect improvements in energy density, meaning we can pack more power into the same size battery. And finally, longer cycle life, meaning those batteries are going to last longer before they need to be replaced.
So better batteries, cheaper batteries, and batteries that last longer, that sounds like a winning combination.
It does, and those advancements are only going to make energy storage even more attractive and accelerate its adoption across all these different applications.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the different ways that energy storage can actually be used. Because we've talked about the technologies, but how are they being applied in practice?
Yeah, so the report explores this whole spectrum of applications for energy storage, and it's really exciting to see how this technology can transform all these different sectors.
Okay, so let's start with one of the most obvious ones, energy time shifting.
Energy time shifting, yeah, this is a classic example of how energy storage can be used to optimize the grid and save money. It's all about taking advantage of those fluctuations in energy prices throughout the day. So you charge your batteries when electricity is cheap, typically during off-peak hours, and then you discharge them when demand is high and prices are higher.
So it's kind of like buying low and selling high, but with electricity.
Exactly. And this can help consumers save money on their electricity bills, and it helps reduce those peak demand periods, which is good for the grid as a whole.
Makes sense. Now, what about the role of energy storage in providing what the report calls ancillary services to the grid? I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what those are.
Sure. So ancillary services, those are basically the services that help to keep the grid stable and reliable. They include things like frequency regulation, voltage support, and spinning reserves. Think of them as kind of the behind-the-scenes work that keeps the lights on.
Okay, so essential, but often overlooked.
Right. And traditionally, these services have been provided by conventional power plants, but energy storage can play a role here too.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, batteries can respond much faster than those traditional power plants, which makes them ideal for providing those critical grid services. They can quickly inject power into the grid when it's needed, or absorb excess power to maintain stability.
So it's about speed and agility.
Exactly. And another really interesting application of energy storage is something called transmission and distribution grid upgrade deferral.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Can you unpack that one for us? What does that actually mean?
Sure. So as the demand for electricity grows, utilities often need to upgrade their transmission and distribution infrastructure to handle that increased load. This could mean upgrading power lines, transformers, substations, all of that.
So it's about keeping up with those growing energy demands. But I imagine those upgrades can be pretty expensive.
They can be very expensive and time-consuming, and that's where energy storage comes in. By using energy storage to smooth out those peaks in demand, utilities can actually avoid or delay those costly upgrades.
So it's about making the most of the existing infrastructure.
Exactly. Think of it like adding an extra lane to a highway during rush hour, but without actually having to widen the road.
Much more efficient. I like it.
Right. And the report highlights some of the potential cost savings of using energy storage for this purpose. In many cases, it's actually cheaper to install energy storage than to build new transmission and distribution infrastructure.
That's pretty incredible, especially when you think about densely populated urban areas where space is limited and construction costs are so high.
Absolutely. It's a much more cost-effective approach in many situations.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about that challenge of integrating those high levels of variable renewable energy into the grid. We touched on it earlier, but it's worth exploring further.
Yeah, this is the age-old problem with renewables. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. But that's where energy storage can really help to bridge that gap. By storing the energy when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and then releasing it when it's needed, we can make those renewable sources more dispatchable, more reliable.
So turning an unreliable energy source into a reliable one, that's the holy grail.
It is, and the report even explores the potential for energy storage to enable microgrids.
Okay, now what's a microgrid?
So a microgrid is essentially a localized grid that can operate independently of the main grid. It's like a mini power system for a neighborhood, a campus, or even a single building.
So it's about creating these more resilient, self-sufficient energy systems.
Exactly, and energy storage is essential for microgrids because it provides that backup power, and it helps to balance supply and demand within that localized system.
So it's like having your own little power plant that can keep things running even if the main grid goes down.
In a way, yes, and microgrids are becoming increasingly popular, especially in areas where the main grid is unreliable or where there's a desire for greater energy independence.
Yeah, I can see the appeal, particularly for remote communities or islands or even military bases that need to be self-sufficient.
Absolutely. Now, the report also dives into the economics of energy storage, which is, of course, a critical piece of the puzzle.
Right. At the end of the day, if it's not financially viable, it's not going to happen on a large scale.
Exactly. They talk about different approaches to valuing energy storage, determining its return on investment, and they emphasize the importance of considering the full range of benefits that energy storage can provide, not just those that are easily monetized.
Right. So those non-monetizable benefits that we talked about earlier, those need to be factored into the equation as well.
Absolutely, and the report advocates for the development of new market mechanisms that can actually capture those broader benefits, things like capacity markets. And they point out that the economics of energy storage are constantly improving as costs continue to decline and performance gets better.
So the future is looking bright for energy storage.
It is, and this report really lays out a roadmap for India to capitalize on this exciting opportunity and really become a leader in the transition to a cleaner, more sustainable energy future.
It's exciting to see them taking such a proactive approach. Now, you mentioned earlier that the report also includes some specific case studies. I'm curious to see how all of this plays out in the real world. How are they actually implementing these ideas?
Yeah, the case studies are really interesting because they offer these tangible examples of how energy storage is being used on the ground.
Okay, so let's dive into those next.
Sounds good?
Okay, let's get into those real-world examples then, those case studies. What kind of projects did they look at in the report?
Well, they analyzed energy storage at different levels of the grid. So from the feeder level, the distribution transformer level, all the way down to the consumer level.
Okay, so let's start big picture then. What did they find when they looked at energy storage at the feeder level?
So they used their ESIT tool to evaluate this project. Installing energy storage on a feeder in Kolkata, they looked at different scenarios, varying levels of solar penetration, and they even compared different battery types.
Okay, so really trying to understand how those different variables would affect the outcome.
Exactly. They wanted to see, okay, if we use lithium-ion batteries versus lead-acid batteries, how does that impact the economics of the project?
So which battery technology came out on top?
Well, it's interesting. Lead-acid batteries, they're cheaper up front, but they have a shorter lifespan, so you have to replace them more often. So when you look at the total cost of ownership over the lifetime of the project, lithium-ion batteries actually ended up being more cost-effective.
So it's not just about the initial purchase price. You have to consider those long-term costs as well.
Exactly, and they also considered the environmental impact of battery disposal, which is a big factor, and ultimately they concluded that lithium-ion is a more sustainable solution in this case.
Makes sense to think about the whole life cycle. Okay, so lithium-ion seems to have the edge at the feeder level. What about the distribution transformer level? What do they find there?
So for this one, they focused on a distribution transformer that was heavily loaded, already nearing its capacity, and they wanted to see if energy storage could help defer the need for an upgrade.
So using energy storage to basically squeeze more life out of the existing infrastructure, did it work?
It did. They found that installing energy storage could actually delay the need for that upgrade by a couple years.
Wow, that's significant. I mean, avoiding those upgrades saves a lot of money.
Yeah, for sure. And they even looked at the financial viability, because these energy storage systems aren't cheap. They calculated the return on investment for different scenarios, taking into account things like electricity savings, peak shaving benefits, and of course the cost of the system itself. And their analysis showed that energy storage at the distribution transformer level, it can be a viable option, especially as the cost of batteries continues to come down.
That's encouraging. So we've looked at the feeder level, we've looked at the distribution transformer level. What about energy storage at the consumer level? Did they explore that as well?
They did, yeah. So for this case study, they looked at a scenario with residential consumers all connected to the same distribution transformer. So imagine individual homes equipped with their own energy storage systems.
That's interesting. Seems like that could give homeowners a lot more flexibility and control over their energy use. Was it a cost-effective solution?
Well, in this particular case, the economics weren't quite as favorable. It turns out that the residential electricity tariffs in India, they don't really provide strong incentives for energy storage right now.
So the financial benefits just aren't there yet for most homeowners.
Right. But the report points out that this could change as those tariffs evolve and as new business models emerge, like the subscription-based services we talked about earlier. Those could make it much more appealing for homeowners.
Yeah, those subscription models could be a game changer. But even if the financial incentives aren't quite there yet, aren't there other benefits for homeowners who choose to install energy storage?
Absolutely. The report talks about how energy storage can improve power quality and reliability for consumers, even if the financial returns aren't immediate. It gives you that peace of mind knowing you have backup power if there's an outage, and it can help stabilize voltage fluctuations so your appliances run smoothly.
So it's about peace of mind. It's about having more control over your energy use. I can see the appeal there. Now, this report does a great job of, laying out the analysis, highlighting the opportunities, but it also emphasizes the need for action. What kind of policy changes do they recommend to really support the widespread adoption of energy storage in India?
Well, they lay out this roadmap for creating a more supportive regulatory environment, and a key principle they emphasize is the need for technology-neutral and market-based policies.
So not picking winners and losers, but creating a level playing field where different technologies can compete on their merits.
Exactly. They also highlight the importance of valuing all the benefits that energy storage can provide, not just those that are easily monetized. We need to recognize those broader economic and environmental benefits as well.
Absolutely, because those benefits, even though they're harder to quantify, they're still incredibly valuable.
Right, and they advocate for the development of new market mechanisms that can capture those broader benefits, like those capacity markets we discussed. They also call for policies that streamline the permitting and interconnection processes so it's easier to get these projects approved and connected to the grid.
Because red tape and bureaucracy, they can really slow things down.
Yeah, for sure. And finally, they emphasize the importance of consumer education and awareness. People need to understand the benefits of energy storage and how it can contribute to a cleaner, more reliable, and more affordable energy future.
It's about empowering consumers to make informed choices about their energy use.
Exactly. So this report really goes beyond just the technology. It provides this holistic view of the challenges and opportunities associated with energy storage in India.
It's been a fascinating deep dive into this world of energy storage. And it's clear that this is not just some niche technology anymore. It's moving into the mainstream, and it's going to play a huge role in shaping the energy landscape of the future.
It is, and it's exciting to see a country like India taking such a proactive approach to this, really laying the groundwork for a more sustainable energy future.
I agree, and I think this roadmap that they've laid out, it offers a vision of a future where clean, reliable energy is accessible to everyone, and that's something worth striving for.
It is, and I hope our listeners are, as excited about the potential of energy storage as we are.
I have a feeling they are. Until next time, keep exploring.